Hi, everybody, and welcome back to Coffin Talk Interviews with the Living, a weekly podcast that explores how our views on death affect the way we live our life. This week, our guest is Michael Hawley. He's coming to us from Los Angeles, but he's originally from Cincinnati, Ohio, and he's a death doula. He's also a death project manager. He had a longer title in the interview, but he's a great, gregarious, hilarious guy who also knows when and how to get serious about the topic which this show is centered on, which is death. But talk about a person you want to be working in this industry. Just pure compassion, pure sympathy, but also a rational, level-headed approach. We've had a few people in his line of work on the show, and I just want to thank all of you who have come on, because all of you have changed my opinion about like the hopefulness of changing the conversation about death. And so if you have been on before, I don't want you to feel remiss thinking that I'm just plowing through different people. It's more that I think to evoke the positive conversations of what this podcast wants to do, I need to have more and more people who actually work intimately with those who are dying. So Michael was a perfect fit for the episode. Among the many, many quotes that I'm going to try to figure one out for like the social media stuff, I think one of my favorites was at the end when he just said formaldehyde causes cancer, because I think that's something no one talks about, and I had definitely not thought about it before. I knew vaguely that it was true, but we put formaldehyde in people and then we bury them in nature, and it can cause it can seep into the ground. The people who work have to inhale it and work around it. So if nothing else, that was kind of an interesting scientific aspect of this interview, but of course it's much more of a metaphysical thing. And also at one point I talk about relatives of mine using the word unfair with the death of their mother, and I just want to make it clear in case it was misunderstood later in the interview, because that's why I'm doing it up front. I understand why people say this isn't fair, and I understand that feeling myself. Like I've had it with the separation with my son, for example, but I do feel ultimately that if you want to heal and you don't want to be a permanent member of victimhood, as I call it, you need to look at life differently to change that philosophy. So it's not that things are fair or not fair. It's that if your attitude employs those words, it, in my opinion, increases suffering. It does not decrease it. So I just wanted to mention that because I didn't want to like stop the interview just to talk about my personal philosophy, because my job as an interviewer is to interview my guests, and then I can give a little bit of my opinions in the intro to these, and occasionally my answers with the guests. So I just wanted to make that clear, because I love people and I'm trying much harder than ever before to be impeccable with my words, which is my way of saying to not speak so loosely and to just casually generalize and make sweeping statements about my life or anything like that. It's not something that's really like a big problem in my life, but I wanted to set good goals for this year. And come early February, I realized that that's something I could really, really tighten down on this year. And I believe I came up with the term I didn't come up with, I believe I found the term in the famous book called The Four Agreements. And I want to say it's Miguel Ruiz, but I'm not sure. I'm probably not remembering the name right. I read too much. But The Four Agreements is definitely where it comes from. But being impeccable with your word is something that I think is a lost art. And I think it's, if every person works on it themselves, things just instantly get better. It would be impossible to have a lot of the social chaos that's going on if people were impeccable with their words, meaning you don't lie and you're careful in what you say. You don't talk negatively about other people, even if you have an opportunity to do so. So that's kind of why I just gave that intro and tried to explain myself, because I really want to put my best foot forward and to model the behaviors that I want to see around me. And especially as a father with two young children and one a little older, it's also important for me to model for them. So anyway, those are my thoughts. Kick it, Sam. Hi, everybody, and welcome back to Coffin Talk, Interviews with the Living, a weekly podcast that explores how our views on death affect the way we live our life. This week, our guest is Michael Hawley. He's a death doula who offers a circle of care approach to help people facing the end of life. His unique path to death work was shaped by a successful career in department store leadership and the beauty industry, where he cultivated sharp skills in leadership, team development, and customer care. He offers a distinct perspective as he views death as a natural and inevitable part of life, akin to the birthing process. For much more information, you can visit his website, Suivez-moi. That will be spelled out, and there will be a link in the notes, because I believe most of you probably don't speak French, but it would be easy to reach him and to find out more about his services. So please check out the notes if you want to know about that. And without any further delays, let's welcome Michael to the show. Hi, Michael. How are you?
Good morning. Good to see you. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's a pleasure, and we're definitely aligned. We had a little pre-chat, and I can't wait to get into what you do and why you do it, because obviously this show is all about promoting exactly what you do. But before we get into that, we always ask every guest three questions. How old are you? Where did you grow up? And what generation, if any, do you consider yourself a member of?
I'm 67. I grew up in Cincinnati, Ohio, and I'm the tail end of the boomers.
Sounds good. And are you still in Ohio or are you elsewhere?
I'm in Los Angeles.
Oh, cool. Great. Okay. I went to college in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, so I've been to Cincy a few times, and it's nice.
Yeah, Pittsburgh and Cincinnati are similar.
Yeah, totally. Cool. Well, how long have you been in Los Angeles for?
I've been out here for about 12 years. I kind of, after Cincinnati, I went to San Francisco for 10, New York for 10, Chicago. I'm on these 10-year cycles, it seems. New York to Chicago to LA. So I've overstayed my welcome in LA, but I don't know if there's any place else I want to go.
Yeah, that makes sense. I'm from San Francisco Bay Area, so I grew up in Berkeley area. And I love Chicago. I've always wanted to move there. That's like the big one city I never got to, but we'll see. But I like Los Angeles a lot, and the weather is the main reason I wouldn't leave if I were
You
you.
can't beat the weather. Other than San Diego, you can't beat the
Oh,
weather
yeah,
in
yeah. Definitely. Well, there you go. You can move south to San Diego for the next 10.
I could do that.
And when you were doing your department store leadership, was that in Cincinnati? Was that all over? Where did you
That was
start?
in all of the cities that I mentioned. I worked primarily for Saks and Bloomingdale's.
Oh,
At the
wow.
beginning of my career, those companies don't exist anymore with the retail consolidation. But the names that everyone, Saks is certainly in the news these days, and Bloomingdale's is actually thriving, which I'm happy to say as an alumni.
That's awesome. That's really cool. Yeah. As a child of the 80s, those are like two of the biggest names by far in my head, even as a pre-consumer. And yeah, that's really cool. So was the beauty industry tied into those, like in that department, or is that a separate career as well?
Yes, no, it tied in, and I was responsible during part of my career. I was responsible for the cosmetics business at Bloomingdale's and at Saks, corporately, and with responsibility for running the cosmetics departments in the stores. And after I will say graduated from retail, I went to the vendor side for a while. So I've got experience on both sides of the business.
That's really cool. Yeah, I worked. I did retail. I did like restaurant work, but I also became a manager. So like you, I've seen both sides, and it's always interesting because that perspective really helps you see like larger context of arguments going on like in any country, not just America, about like labor, workers, management, corporations. I'm more curious based on the two that you worked for and where you are now. How do you feel about like the idea of the corporation? Like, do you think it's a noble idea that it can work when it's done effectively? I'm just curious. This is not going anywhere.
It's an excellent question. Um, uh, I drank the Kool-Aid when I was in that work.
Mhm.
I believed in the mission at the time. I'm not sure I believe in the mission at this point in time. I think that our culture has evolved to a point where profit becomes more important than people, which is never how I looked at the business. As a store manager, I viewed the success of my people as my responsibility. I didn't have to worry about my success. How to make them successful was my job.
Wow, that's a great answer. I'm shocked by how succinct that was. Yeah, because it's just weird. I'm in my 40s and I'm just coming to this like weird point where I'm like, gosh, I care so much about people, but I also not only drank the Kool-Aid, but I was raised on the Kool-Aid, and I do live in America and I'm a citizen and I want to help our country. I want to help all of us. And so what you said is exactly what I like to hear. And then unfortunately it started out with what I don't want to hear, which is I drank the Kool-Aid because I'm like just looking for like solutions that could keep structure, infrastructure and everything going. I don't want like a great reset. That scares the crap out of me.
Certainly. Well, for the challenges of capitalism, it's still the best system. I mean, if it weren't for capitalism, all the development that happened in this country in the last 250 years would not have happened. If people weren't making money, didn't have an opportunity to make money. So I think in the future, as we go to 5D or however we're evolving as humanity, the balance of that, it's fine to make profit. There's nothing wrong with profit. But when the profit overtakes what's good for people, That's, to me, that's a problem.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think it's interesting because working in reverse now with what your current career is, and it's a great career working as I called you a death doula. I don't know if that's,
Yes.
yeah, okay. So, and for people, actually, before I get into this part of the interview, why don't you explain to my audience what a death doula is by your own terms?
Okay, a death doula is, many people think of, when they hear doula, think of birthing doulas, midwives, which has been around for a while. This is the same concept, but at the other end of life. So I work with people approaching the end of life, and hopefully before, from a planning and education standpoint, in order to normalize our conversations around death. And that goes straight through to the actual dying process and what the families can expect. Supporting the caregivers is as important as supporting the patient. And then through the final vigil and even working with the families with the grief.
And we talked before the interview. I used to work in hospice. It was brief. It was only about 4 years, but it was enough to compel me to start a podcast and do this for many years now. What what do you think? Let's just start with what you said about normalizing the conversations about death. Do you think that conversations about death have ever been normal in the American culture, like just the one that you and I both know about?
Yes, I actually do. 125 years ago, before the start of the 20th century, it was really the Civil War, most people don't know this, that began the funeral industry as we know it today. President Lincoln wanted to send the bodies home. And so that started embalming out in the battlefields, which started that whole process. Now, the funeral industry is, well, that wasn't the question.
No, no, please, please, yeah, just go.
The funeral industry is controlled in this country by a couple of major conglomerates. What looks like mom and pop funeral homes where your family maybe has had services for generations is not mom and pop. They're actually owned by major corporations, pursuant to the conversation we had earlier. But death was normal. The older people taught younger people how to care for their families as they were dying. My grandfather, who was killed accidentally very young in 1938, he was laid out at home. Yes, there was a funeral director and he was embalmed, but it was literally in the days when living rooms were called parlors. That's
Wow.
why the parlor's point was a funeral parlor, actually. And I think that we've become so far removed from it and so sanitized, and it's become a medical event, which it is not.
Mm,
It's a life event.
wow.
Um, and we tend to push it away because we're uncomfortable. There's nothing to be uncomfortable about. We can, but we've got to talk about it. We've got to make it more common. We've got to stop the euphemisms. You ask about what I call myself. I call myself different things depending on my audience. I think death doula is important, um, because that's the most clear thing. Obviously, the word death is triggering for a lot of people. So I can say end of life coach, transition. I kind of like end of life project manager because there's so much that goes into it.
Yeah.
But that's a little obtuse.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. So I just rely on death doula, and I think as part of normalizing the conversation, we need to call ourselves death doulas or death coach or something. It's got to be about death and dying, because if I'm shying away from it, how can I change that for other people?
Yeah, we're always trying to figure out what title to put with the episodes, and what you talked about is like the chief issue I have. Like when I tell someone I do a podcast, they're like, "Oh, what's it about?" And they feign interest, and like maybe there's a chance I'll get them to listen to it. As soon as I say the title, they're like, "Excuse me, Coffin Talk? What is that a joke?" And I'm like, "Well, yeah, it's playing off the old Saturday Night Live skit of Coffee Talk, but it's about death and dying." And then they just get, you know exactly the look I'm talking about.
I
Probably
know,
every
I know
party you've been
exactly. Look,
to.
well, and I've shared with people, with friends, that I'm having this conversation with you today, and they hear coffee talk first, and then
Yeah.
they kind of cock their head. My friends, with anybody that knows me, that conversations around death are relatively normalized. I talk about it all the time. In addition, I'm a hospice volunteer in order to get more experience at bedside. And I love you. You fall in love with your people.
Yeah, definitely. That's the thing that to me is so tragic, because it started when I was really young. I just like felt compelled to go with my mom to visit friends of hers who were dying, and it doesn't make sense, but it does. You know how everyone's childhood stories end up making sense. But the point I'm trying to make is that it always seemed normal to me, and it never, like when my grandpa died, I bawled my eyes out, but it wasn't like. And actually, this is the next question I wanted to ask. To me, it wasn't ever unfair. There was never like, even when one of my best friends, not my best, but like one of my best friends died at 35, while I felt it was tragic, while I felt it, blah, 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 I never used the word unfair, because that just doesn't make sense to me. So I'm curious how you deal with that with actual people, like your clients. Like if someone says like, this is so unfair, or like my mother-in-law just passed away, and numerous people in her life have, literally been like crying and saying, this is so unfair. And I never interrupt. I don't say anything. And I, of course, have sympathy for that response, but I don't agree. I don't think it's unfair. How do you deal with that?
Well, personally, I'm not someone who tends to think of anything as unfair. What happens, happens.
Yeah.
Right. And it's not about deserving it or not deserving it. It's about being natural. People do think it's unfair, but this work requires that we meet the customer, the client, where they are with whatever it is they believe. Many people still believe that the morphine given at end of life hastens death. It actually doesn't.
Wow.
It actually makes it a more peaceful passage, because it normalizes the breathing. If you're having trouble breathing and not getting enough oxygen, that's anxiety producing, regardless of the consciousness level of the patient. Morphine takes all of that away. So I don't see it as unfair, but like I said, it's important to meet the client and the families where they are.
Yeah. And so on kind of the same trajectory, how do you feel about euthanasia in general? And how do you feel about it as like it's being actually legalized in this country, in Canada?
Well, Canada's certainly ahead of the curve, farther ahead of the curve than we are.
Yeah.
Uh, um, medic, I don't use the term euthanasia. That's what we do with pets.
Okay. Yeah.
And I have one that's walking in and out of the camera field. Sorry about that.
No worries at all.
Um, I believe in medical aid in dying. I believe that everyone has agency and is sovereign and gets to choose, because there comes a point where people don't want to live the way they're living. It isn't that they want to die, but they don't want to live the way they're living. With my own mother, there was a point, and it was crystal clear. She battled it and struggled. She was the most independent, didn't want to, she wasn't done until finally she did realize. She fell, classic.
Yeah.
In her 90s. She fell, broke a hip, and that began a 10-month downward spiral, which is very, very common. There was a day where she just asked me straight out, tell me the truth. Am I ever getting out of this bed? And I said, no, I don't think so. And she said, why do you think that? And I explained it. She had dementia also and didn't even realize why she was there. But once she accepted it, she stopped fighting and she leaned into it. And it was probably 3 weeks, but those 3 weeks were some of the best 3 weeks of our lives together.
That's so sweet. Wow.
It can go that way.
Yeah. I'm almost crying. That's like just I completely understand. And we actually just had a scare with my father. He broke his back. He's 79. It was going bad. And then, you've seen it before. You just see that shift where like he was able to start walking again, and now he's back, and he just drove today for the first time in 5 months. So it's like,
congratulations.
Yeah. So it's incredible.
That's a big milestone.
Yeah. And it's cool because even though the next time might not work out the same way, it's in my family, we've always talked about things very realistically. And my parents, told me about like a will when I was like 20, and I actually hated it. I was like very angry with them. I'm like, don't talk about dying. But I'm actually really thankful now. And I'm curious, this sounds like I'm nitpicking, but it's not. I actually just think you're going to have a great answer to it. As someone who has pets and enjoys and likes animals, why did you say like euthanasia is what we call it for animals? Are you talking about like euphemisms and how society treats it, or do you feel like
Yes.
they're very different? Yeah.
Yeah, I think the word euthanasia, it sounds, people hear mercy killing,
Yeah.
right? Which you don't, isn't appropriate as it relates to human beings in our culture today.
Yeah.
The number of states that have approved medical aid in dying are increasing all the time. California's became permanent recently.
Oh, cool.
Washington and Oregon are ahead of us,
Yeah.
actually, more progressive. And I had a client who was dying of Parkinson's disease, and he had been a really active guy, and he hated being in that situation. And I was talking to his wife. I spent most of the time with his wife, supporting her. And I asked if anyone had discussed medical aid in dying with her. And she said, no, what's that? And so I explained it to her. She went in, woke him up, and said, Jim, if we can end this, would you want to do that? And he said, I won't say exactly what he said, but he said, what in the world are you waiting for?
Yeah.
So we set that process into motion. And what frequently happens is the patient actually, even once the medicines arrive, they die before they take them.
Wow.
Because I think them making that choice gives them the agency and the sovereignty to go when they choose to. Because I also believe we all die, we choose the moment of our deaths.
Yeah.
Not everyone believes that, but I believe it's true. How often do you hear of someone who waits for a child from far away to arrive before they pass over, or the family's all around and the patient's struggling, virtually at the end, and they wait until everybody goes for coffee and they're alone.
Yeah.
That is an accident. That can't be accidental.
Yeah.
And like yourself, my mother and I always talked about because her father was killed when he was 30. My father had an aneurysm in the frontal lobe of the brain that blew while she was pregnant with me.
Oh.
So he was lobotomized. So
Wow.
to my mom, life was uncertain. So she wanted to make sure that I was prepared for everything that might happen. So we always talked about it. So it's always been, the conversation about death has always been normal to me.
Yeah, I fully subscribe to the we know when we're going to die thing. And I actually had a weird moment 2 weeks ago. I felt compelled to get a lot of things in order. And I was like, oh no, I have 2 young kids. I was like, no, this is not like I can't have this happen now. They're too young. I just want them to be a little older if it has to. And then I realized like you're speculating, it just was an idea to do something. But I've seen too many times, like, the person just suddenly gets a bunch of things done and then a week later they're gone. And along the same line, the only other question we ask every guest, I think this is now the best time to ask it, is so in addition to choosing our own death and that aspect of agency, what do you actually think happens to us when we die? What do you think will happen to you when you die? Hi everybody, this is Mike Oppenheim, the host of Coffin Talk, the show you're currently listening to, and I'm interrupting to ask you if you would mind doing me a favor and subscribing to my online publication called You Are Here on Substack. It features weekly essays. I also have fiction, and of course there are links to the podcast and all the bonus episodes. It's completely free, and I would love your support, so please head over to mikeyop.com, that's MIKEYOPP.com, and sign up today. Thank you. Bye.
Excellent question. I was trained like many people. I grew up as a Protestant religion, a Methodist mainline church, and believed in heaven and hell because that was what was taught. I no longer really believe that. I think it's returning home. I think our consciousness returns to source or God, that energy of all that is. Very often people talk about going home at the end. And I think that's the soul returning home.
Mhm. Wow, I like it. I think that's a unique blend of, like, this is episode 257, so I started to hear some repeats, but I have not heard anyone who's combining, because when you say returning, that like really evokes a positive response in my
It's
head.
where we came. It's where
Yeah.
we came from. It's familiar. It's kind of like babies have a different energy about them than we do after we've started to be trained to be
Yeah.
humans and
Yeah.
live in this world.
Yeah.
Babies are fascinated and just learning and pure.
Yeah.
And and I think that often they at that point still know where they've come from at a
Yeah.
certain level,
I
right?
like,
And so getting to
yeah.
the end of life, it would be like going home, wouldn't it?
Yeah.
After, because every life has pain and every life has struggles. That's part of the deal of having a physical experience, right? Our
Yeah.
soul, we learn something. We come here to learn something. And how do we usually learn? Because things are painful. So in that regard, yes, it's joyous. Beyond the fear, I'm not afraid to die. I'm uncomfortable about dying.
Yeah.
I don't
Yeah.
want to be
Yeah.
in pain and I don't want to be incapacitated. But the actual death, when it comes, it comes.
Yeah.
I can't change it.
No, that was so well stated, and I think that's exactly why, like, the other day that I had that reaction was, it's not like, oh, I'm afraid like I'm gonna die in a plane crash. It's, what if my kids have to suffer without their dad? Like these what ifs. But also that would just be their contract. That's just and I tell my children when they were young, I say like, you're just groggy because you're here on Earth, but don't worry, this is a blip. You'll be back. Like, I'm here to help you get a personality so you can hate yourself and see a therapist. Don't worry. Like,
You can spend your lifetime recovering from what I did to you.
yeah, exactly. And anytime anything goes wrong, I just say, okay, just like see your therapist later about this. We'll deal with it. And actually, yeah, speaking of therapy, and because your work is very closely related, in my opinion, you're an end of life therapist is something I would say. You're helping someone with the hardest and biggest decision they're going to make. Have you ever and I've asked this, I've interviewed a few people in your line of work, so I want to ask you, because I asked all of them, have you ever had to fire a client? Have you ever like had a situation
Yes.
that was, yeah? And do you mind
Yes.
sharing it?
Actually,
Yeah.
not at all. She happened to be a friend whose father was in terminal renal failure. And she engaged me. And I realized after 2 or 3 sessions, I could not help her. She wasn't receptive. You know, we like to be right about things.
Mhm.
And she was very right about what she thought she was right about. And I couldn't help her. So it was frustrating for me. I wasn't doing any good for her. So, yes, I fired her.
Wow.
I ended the relationship.
Yeah, that makes sense. And thank you for sharing that. A couple more questions. We talked about the funeral industry early on, and the
Mm.
word industry always gives me the creeps, just because it just sounds so heartless. But I'm curious. There must be, and I actually don't know. I have not experienced. So even though people around me have died, I've never once been to a funeral home. I've never had to like purchase anything. I've never dealt with any of that stuff. I have a million friends who have, and none of them have a positive story about it. But I have to imagine there's got to be some good things about it. So like, do you believe in the funeral process? Do you believe in like burials? Do you believe in embalming? Like where do you draw lines, if any?
I feel differently for myself personally than I feel in general. So I'm going
Yeah.
to answer the question in general
Okay.
for all of us.
Yeah. Cool.
Yeah, I believe in the process. A funeral, a celebration of life, if you
Yeah.
will,
Totally.
is an important marker for some people for them to come to accept and have their grief publicly acknowledged. That provides completion for a lot of people. Some people don't need that, but for those that do, it's absolutely appropriate. I don't think embalming is necessary, even for being for memorial services or funerals that are happening relatively quickly. There are other ways at this point in time to keep the body cool so it doesn't deteriorate without embalming, which is so poisonous to the environment. I mean, it's awful. Formaldehyde causes cancer. We've known that for years. So the funeral workers dealing with it, it seeps into the ground and all of that. But there's a place for all of it. We're fortunate to be here now because we have options. For example, my plans are my body gets donated to UCLA's College of Medicine,
Cool.
and they use aquamation. So I will be cremated, but it's through a water hydrolysis process as opposed to fire, which is much more responsible for the environment. And what I will turn into is innate water that can be released into the environment.
Wow.
There's also human composting, which that word can make people, pull back, but that's a growing thing. That will be here next year, legal in California. It's legal in Oregon and Washington now, again, the more progressive states, where you can be buried naturally with no vault, no coffin, and literally, turn to become become nutrients for the soil, and to give back. And if life is this cycle of recycling, and whether we believe souls come and go more than once or not, we came from matter. Would it not be good to give it back instead of using land and resources to bury people? For those people that want that, that's fine. But many of us don't care. I mean, when I was a kid, my aunts used to go, they called it Decoration Day in those days. But, on Memorial Day, they'd go to the cemetery and any relative that they knew got flowers. People don't do that to the same extent that they used to. It used to be a thing, and families would do that together. Well, if there's a place that you never go to, then what's the point?
Yeah. It's so funny because you've mentioned Oregon a few times. I lived in Portland for 4 years and I would have stayed there the rest of my life, but the weather, just what everyone says, it's just true. Seasonal depression, couldn't take it, left. But there were beautiful cemeteries everywhere. People were, they treated them like libraries. You could go and just read books. It was like a very death positive culture. I'm not shocked that they lead the country in most of the things we've discussed. And it's funny because when my dad was not feeling good and kind of headed down, he kept saying like, this has to go, this has to end. And I was like, well, you should have moved to Oregon 6 months ago to establish residency, So I'm like, It's just funny because in my head, I just keep thinking like, gosh, if only they could change their legislation to just make it like a tour, like Colorado when they first legalized marijuana before any other states, the first state to figure out the death tourism, economy might work. Sorry, go ahead.
That's progressing as well, actually. I mean, used to be in order to you couldn't cause an end of life if you weren't a resident in that state. Like, for example, even for the states that had medical aid in dying, you had to be a resident of that state. You could not go there and have it happen because the drugs that cause it are prescribed by a doctor, and and there's a cocktail of drugs that the patient has to take themselves. But that's also changing. The laws are being amended in many places to where, yes, you could do that. So actually, end of life travel plans will be a thing.
That's cool. I mean, it's great. Like, and I know people are skeptical and they think like, well, what about someone who wants inheritance and they're like tricking someone into it? I get all that. I'm not going to get into that on this show. I probably at any point, because I just believe, you have to make freedom free to people, and if people abuse it, that's not my issue. My issue is not oppressing people at the end of life and forcing them to go through horrible pain and and all that. So
Well, and there's
yeah,
exception in the rule to that
yeah,
point. Yes, there's going to be situations where people are inappropriate and self-serving,
hmm
but most people are not like that.
yeah. Yeah, I think I wish that was kind of broadcasted at the Super Bowl this year. I wish like that was a general message that they were spreading in our country, is that like most people are actually like kind, good-hearted, and just want to be left
Yes,
alone for the most part.
and regardless of their political beliefs and
Yeah,
all of that, most people are good. They're
yeah.
they're they're good, kind people.
And actually, speaking of which, let's end on perhaps a funny note, if not a heartwarming note. You can pick one or both. It's up to you. Either the funniest client story you have, or in addition to that, the most heartwarming story you have, or one of those two, if any.
Um, there was once a gentleman that had been at near death for quite some time. All the family comes in, this one's coming from here, that one's coming from there. And he would sit up, after being in the end of life coma, really, he would sit up and say, "Goodbye, guys." And he'd lay back down, and they're all like preparing, and then he didn't die. I mean, that happened several times, which is very funny.
That is.
The other one that we used to roll on the floor hearing her tell it, a friend of my mother's had an Aunt Helen. And Aunt Helen lived in Cincinnati, but Aunt Helen was traveling in Europe and died in Europe. So everything the family went through to bring Aunt Helen home was, I mean, talk about, death tourism. Aunt Helen's travels after death were fascinating and hysterically.
That's awesome. That's great. I thank you so much for coming on the show. You've been incredible. We always end the show the same way, which is instead of me talking, I like to let my guest kind of complete their thoughts. So is there anything you want to add to anything you said in this interview, or is there just something you want to tell my audience? As I mentioned previously, there will be a large link to find you in the notes section. So
Well, first, I want to thank you for this opportunity. I've enjoyed it very much.
awesome.
We've talked a lot about the actual end. A lot of what a death doula does is support the families in planning. The greatest gift you can give your children or anyone in your life that loves you is to have the plans laid out, not necessarily done, but I want this, I don't want that. I want this to happen in the room when I'm dying, I don't want that. I want this person there, I don't want that person there. All of those things. And do you want to be intubated or not? Do you want to be resuscitated or not? It's important to have those conversations because it's a horrible thing when death is unexpected and the family isn't prepared and they have no idea what their loved one would want. And that's an unfair burden at a time that people are grappling with their emotions. So do the kind thing and start talking about it.
Wow, that was great. Thank you so much, Michael. You've just been a pleasure to talk to. Just a great guest, and you're doing great services for the world. And I think what you said is just so important for everyone to remember, which is most of us are good, and corporations may be out of control, but we can take the control back by just being good, and you don't have to make unethical decisions.
Just
for
do
your
the right
employers.
thing.
Yeah, totally agree. Could not phrase it any better myself. So thank you again, Michael. And the best way to support the show is to head over to mikeyop.com. That's MIKEYOPP.com. So please support us by heading over there and subscribing for free. And thank you again to Michael Hawley. And my name is Mike Oppenheim. You have been listening to or watching Coffin Talk, and we will see you soon.
You are my moon.